Lenin never regarded the Republic of Soviets as an end in itself. He always looked on it as an essential link for strengthening the revolutionary movement in the countries of the West and the East, an essential link for facilitating victory of the working people of the whole world over capitalism. Lenin knew that this was the only right conception, both from the international standpoint and from the standpoint of preserving the Republic of Soviets itself. Lenin knew that this alone could fire the hearts of the working people of the whole world with determination to fight the decisive battles for their emancipation. That is why, on the very morrow of the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, he, the greatest of geniuses who have led the proletariat, laid the foundation of the Workers' International. That is why he never tired of extending and strengthening the union of the working people of the whole world, the Communist International. You've seen during the past few days the pilgrimage of scores and hundreds of thousands of working people to Comrade Lenin's funeral pyre. Before long, you'll see the pilgrimage of representatives of millions of working people to Comrade Lenin's tomb. You need not doubt that the representatives of millions will be followed by representatives of scores and hundreds of millions from all parts of the earth, who will come to testify that Lenin was the leader not only of the Russian proletariat, not only of the European workers, not only of the colonial East, but of all the working people of the globe. This was a reading from a portion of a speech delivered at the Second All-Union Congress of Soviets a few days after Lenin's death in 1924. Those were the words of Joseph Stalin. In this episode, we will be covering the key Marxist-Leninist text written by Stalin himself, entitled Foundations of Leninism. A work written 100 years ago, it speaks to today in surprising ways. It's for this reason and more we chose this text to pilot our Theory Beats multimedia project, which is accessible exclusively via Patreon. Check it out. With that said, now is as good a time as ever to formally announce the Stalin Eras, a multi-part series covering the life and times of Joseph Stalin. To get more info on the project and get a glimpse at the official poster, check out our socials at ProlsPod now. Don't forget to let others know about the project too. We're excited to share it. In the meantime, enjoy the episode.
Hello, and welcome to ProlsPod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlsPod and on TikTok at prols.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/prolspod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. This episode is brought to you by, and this is a rare, unironic sponsor, quotations by Michael Parenti, brought to us by Anti-Imperialist Parenti Posting and Red Prince Publishing. So we'll have a spot referencing that in the middle of the episode. Today we're going to be talking about basically Foundations of Leninism text written by Joseph Stalin, which coincides pretty well with the current run of Theory Beats, which is going through that same document. But first, who do we have with us here today?
We have Tony.
This is Joel.
And today's subject matter expert is Ray. Where would you like to begin, Ray?
So for our inaugural theory episode, first we've got some notes at the top. This piece by itself is highly, highly accessible. You can probably get through it in an afternoon and still understand it at that pace. Or if you want to read it at a more leisurely pace, you could read one of the 9 sections a day for 9 days and honestly be putting in less than 30 minutes of reading each day. Please, please, please don't get intimidated, right? The purpose of this episode and episodes like it is to encourage all of you to engage with these texts, to come to your own conclusions, to have discussions with your comrades, and of course, to just continue to build your historical awareness and your class consciousness. These texts are written for working people. They're meant to be digestible. There are a few references, historical references throughout this text that you might not get, maybe people's names that you forget or whatever, something like that. And honestly, without them, it's going to make a great deal of sense and you're going to get a lot out of this document anyway. But along the way, we'll stop to keep offering you some supplementary information in case there's something that goes over your head. It's just kind of fun to note here that while Lenin is alive, he's not doing a Leninism, right? Like Lenin is experiencing himself as a Marxist and his work is analyzed, right, by those people who came after him and then distilled into his theory, which I think is just an interesting thing to bring up about how knowledge production works throughout this period. One of the critiques that we get into right at the top is that Lenin and the so-called Leninists are not concerned with theory, which is just a wild irony considering that now he's one of like the preeminent theorists of communism in the world. And my point here is that the distinction between which revolutionaries are so-called great theorists and thinkers and which aren't is kind of arbitrary because they're all sort of going off of what came before and they're all applying it to the choices that are in front of them.
Yes, I think a good definition when thinking about the concepts Leninism or Marxism is we're thinking of what theory comes originating from that thinker after that thinker has already passed. So whatever comes after that thinker, for example, Marx, would be Marxism. Perhaps the people who were around when Marx was alive and agreed with Marx at the time were Marxians, but they weren't Marxists.
Right.
It's thought that Marxism was incepted from what comes after Marx, and the same with Lenin and Leninism.
Right. It's so true that when codifying somebody's body of work and their thoughts and their choices and their actions and distilling it into an ism is a generative process that's not just made up of that person and the time that they were alive, but is an amalgamation of those who came after them. And we're trying to make sense of it and make it something that can be more broadly applicable. And that's a really good point. So kind of the purpose or one of the purposes of this piece is to compare it a lot, to compare Leninism a lot to other tendencies at the time. Most importantly, we're going to see a lot of comparison to the Second International, but also to anarchists and some other groups as well. Because here, what Stalin is trying to do is carve out the distinct characteristics and qualities of Leninism. I think that this is like a really helpful document for those of you who might be listening and you're still trying to determine your tendency and exploring your position on certain historical fissures or conflicts or events in time. And also really important in exploring how a party should or could be structured and what purpose the party serves. So before we get into the introduction, this is the introduction to the introduction, the remix to the remix. Anyone want to tackle, like, when was this written? What is the historical context? What's going on at this time? There's also like a meta-historical point here where Stalin is writing about Lenin's time. And also like, who the fuck is the Second International?
Sure. So I can provide some of that context. So before I do that, I just want to say that further to what Ray had said at the start, the text is very accessible. I myself am not a theory head. If you know me from my work on ProlsPod or on my other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism, I'm more of a history guy. I love socialist history, but if you're someone who generally feels, daunted by the task of engaging with theory, want to recommend you read this work, of course, but also I think this podcast will be very useful for you. You're not alone. You're
not alone.
Thanks for that, Jeremy.
Stalin's here with you.
So, foundations of Leninism. What was happening when this text was written? Why was it written? So the texts which make up Foundations of Leninism were delivered first by Stalin as a series of lectures at the Sverdlov Communist University, which was a Moscow university for party education. The timing of these lectures is very important to understand the direct context. Vladimir Lenin had passed away on January 21st, 1924. Stalin delivered these lectures in April 1924. So usually what occurs when a movement's leader or founder, so to speak, dies untimely, this leaves room for the escalation of the dialectical process of codifying and distilling the departed leader's program in the context of what is to come next. As one could imagine, with someone as prolific a writer and statesman as Lenin, sifting through his works, which demonstrate decades of thought, practice, retreats, compromises, changes of mind, etc., is easier said than done. But regardless, Lenin, as the avatar of the revolution, whose cult or reverence only increased after his death, meant that various inter-party factions understood that they needed to draw a thorough line with their program for the future to Lenin's legacy. So it's within this context that Stalin put forth his understanding of Lenin's theories in a systematic and easy to understand way, as the party was being revitalized with hundreds of thousands of new members joining, and as the party was, in the wake of Lenin's death, in a bit of an identity crisis. So certainly the positions expressed in the foundations of Leninism stood contrary to those of the other emergent school, which was claiming the lineage of Lenin's theories, Trotskyism. Kind of moving on to briefly explaining some important either key organizations to know or events. I think Ray, you'd mentioned the Second International. So the Second International was an organization of socialist and labor parties, which was formed in 1899 and which was dissolved ultimately in 1914. The Second International was like the First International, was vital to linking emergent socialist organizations into a united front to develop a global revolutionary movement. In its height, before the outbreak of World War I, the Second International actually represented parties of all European countries, the US, Canada, and Japan, with membership of about 9 million people, which is just crazy. If there was, if you had 9 million people today as part of your party, that's wild. 100 years ago, that's even crazier. So this was the preeminent international socialist organization, which represented a variety of tendencies from reformist to revolutionary.
Please note that, listeners, right? The variety of tendencies. I really want everybody to really sit with and understand that the foundation of the sort of Second International was like, everybody can join. This is a huge theme in this piece.
It was a big tent party, you could say. So this organization collapsed ultimately in the face of World War I, as the organization's founding principles were to not engage workers in bourgeois wars. And ultimately, all the parties except the Bolsheviks ended up supporting their national government's call to arms to fight against other working class people in World War I. So this criticism is among others that Stalin has.
That is true. However, I believe, because it's been a long time since I read about all this, but this was either the point where the USPD split from the Social Democrats in Germany, or when the KPD split from the USPD, because one of those parties did back their government in World War I, but the sort of principled Marxists who were like, this is absolutely runs contrary to the teachings of Marx. We should not be supporting an imperialist war. That caused the split in that party. But yes, it's one of those things that, like Murray Rothbard, noted shithead and cap philosopher Murray Rothbard, he gave credit to Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht as being one of the handful of Western European socialists who stuck to their principles and did not back their government in the war.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. So we bring up the Second International now because it does factor into Stalin's criticisms in the foundations of Leninism, which we'll get into detail as we go along in our discussion. If there's something to know about the Second International that you can be like, hey, there's something that we all partake of today that's important, is they did proclaim May Day, May 1st, as being a celebration of working class people, which is awesome and definitely something we can applaud them for. And so I guess maybe the last thing to kind of set up now as a bit of quick introduction is what's known as the First Russian Revolution, or the Russian Revolution of 1904, which is again something that gets mentioned throughout the work. Lenin calls this Russian Revolution of 1904 as really the great dress rehearsal for what happens in 1917. The 1904 revolution was essentially sparked by the blowback that resulted from the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which ended in that same year, 1904. So this dissatisfaction that ran through the entire Tsarist Empire was at an all-time high, which set off a chain of workers' strikes, peasant unrest, even mutinies in the military. And probably most importantly, it also led to the emergence of workers' councils for the first time in Russia, which are also known as Soviets. So in response to the public pressure, the Tsar Nicholas II was forced to implement some reforms to quell this emergent revolution. And these reforms included establishing the State Duma, the multi-party system, and implementing a Russian constitution, which gave, quote unquote rights mostly to the bourgeois class of Russia at the time. This really laid the groundwork, or really exposed the cracks in the Tsarist empire, which were then exploited in 1917, of course. What's interesting about 1904 is that many of the revolutionaries that would lead in 1917, most of them, maybe not most of them, but a good portion of them were actually exiled in 1904, which meant that they couldn't participate as much as they probably would have had they not been fucking, exiled to Siberia and shit like that. So yeah. Was there any other introductory things that either Joel or Jeremy wanted to lay down before we rolled into it?
Yes, maybe when we're thinking about the Second International today, we could easily associate it with the German Social Democratic Party, which is in power in Germany, the Labour Party in Great Britain, currently in Latin America, the PT government in Brazil, as well as the Morena Party in Mexico, and I believe in the US it would be the DSA.
Well, that's a good context. Jeremy?
I suppose just there was a holdover for several years after Lenin's passing where, for instance, the NEP, which he helped to put into place, or the Golro, which was basically his plan to bring widespread hydroelectric power to the Soviet Union, was still going on. So there was this kind of like Lenin's vision, more or less, was still being carried out after his death. These plans that he had sort of put into place and built the foundations for were still underway. It had not yet become beyond Lenin, I suppose. So, and I think at the time that Stalin is delivering these speeches, or, this work was published, it was kind of this, I guess, hangover period after Lenin's death where there was not yet a clear new vision for how the Soviet Union was going to proceed. It was still Lenin's vision. So I think it's it's a very interesting time to be publishing a distillation of Lenin's overall political theory when it's basically still his vision that's ruling the nation.
Yeah, and just one final thing I guess I'll add on to what Jeremy said there, is that the NEP was considered, maybe not by everyone in the party, but by large chunks of it, Lenin himself for sure, the new economic program, which was essentially a retreat from moving forward with constructing socialism. And so the party at the time was split on how were we going to move away from the NEP, if we were going to move away from it at all? And what was the timeline for that? And how were we going to do that was a big question of the times.
So just nudging everyone and pulling back the Iron Curtain a little bit here before this, Tony was like, I don't really have much to say on the context. I'm not really sure I have anything to add. Once again, my co-hosts are brilliant. All right, let's get into the introduction. Now, we're no longer introducing the document. This is the document, but there is an introductory section. I think the introduction is hilarious because it reminds me of literally every episode of our podcast and everyone on social media when they're like, okay, guys, we can't cover everything. There's going to be a lot. I don't know if we'll get to everything you want, but I just want to give you a few key points. And that's also how I feel right now about this episode. So let's let Stalin speak in his own words here. He says, the foundations of Leninism is a big subject. To exhaust it, a whole volume would be required. Indeed, a whole number of volumes would be required. Naturally, therefore, my lectures cannot be an exhaustive exposition of Leninism. At best, they can only offer a concise synopsis of the foundations of Leninism. Nevertheless, I consider it useful to give this synopsis in order to lay down some basic points of departure necessary for the successful study of Leninism. So he goes in right away and he's like, okay, right, Lenin was a Marxist, but there's no need to start with Marx because really what we're looking at here is Lenin's contributions to Marxism or applications of Marxism. So it's a little bit like a yes and situation. Then he refutes a couple of the assumptions that people are making about so-called Leninism or emerging Leninism at that time. So he goes, is Leninist Marxism specific to Russia? Like, is it just about Russia? Because that was a criticism at the time. Now we see this as a viable revolutionary theory. But it's important to understand that in the wake of Lenin's death, people are like, oh, he's just a one-hit wonder. This is a revolutionary one-trick pony, right? Is it some kind of 1840s revival that's destined to just like fizzle out? These are the two main criticisms. Would this only work for Russia? And is this some kind of like a mid-1800s revival that's like not really going to have staying power? So Stalin refutes both of these things, and he calls these arguments one-sided and inadequate. He does say, though, that both contain a particle of truth. So then what does he land on in terms of identifying what Leninism is? I'll read this little quote. Leninism is Marxism in the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. So he says that Leninism is, and again, this is another quote, the further development of Marxism. And finally, something to note is that Leninism, he says over and over again here, is inherently militant and revolutionary. Militant and revolutionary. That is inherent. That is built into Leninism. If you're not militant, if you're not revolutionary, you're not doing a Leninism. Stalin attributes this to two important factors. The first one is that Leninism emerges from a proletarian revolution. And since it arises from those material conditions, it's obviously shaped by them. And then the second is that Leninism as a body of work, as a functioning philosophy and applied theory, evolves in contrast to what Stalin calls, and I quote here, the opportunism of, you know him, the Second International. We also see here the introduction of ways in which it sort of stands in contrast to the Second International. And this is really, the intro is very quick, and that's really everything that he says. But before we move on, anyone want to add anything about the intro?
This isn't necessarily about the intro, but just maybe as an interesting historical note is that, well, of course, Stalin before the 1917 revolution, he'd written several works, particularly on the question of nationalities. Since 1917, he hadn't actually published anything that could be called, I guess, a major theoretical work. And so him writing this in 1924, first as lectures, then as a published book, was for him personally an opportunity to position himself as a theoretician in the party, a current one, not just one who'd written something, 10 years ago, but someone who's actively contributing to the development of Marxist theory.
Moving into part one, which I really love because the rest of my co-hosts are definitely history heads, and I'm the one that's more interested in theory. And I feel like Stalin really gets me here because he's like, most working people, they don't have a clear sense of history. They're busy, living their lives, or their minds just like don't kind of work like that. So I feel like related to. And so section 1 is the section of the historical roots of Leninism. So he's like, hey, if you've just been living your life and you don't even know what's been going on, I'll tell you. So first, Stalin points out that Lenin calls imperialism moribund capitalism. So if you don't know all those SAT words, moribund, right? More like muerte or mort is like death, and bund is like bound for, right? So bound for death, careening towards death, terminal decline, right? He's saying that imperialism is capitalism driving toward its deathbed. And we get this hit here with one of my favorite Stalin one-liners, probably, where he says, imperialism carries the contradictions of capitalism to their last bounds, to the extreme limit beyond which revolution begins. Stalin's using this section to lay out for us 3 contradictions. He says there's a bunch of contradictions, but these are the 3 that are the most important that you really need to understand. The first contradiction is between labor and capital, right? This is something that we talk about a lot, which, by the way, even 100 years ago, they're talking about banks, they're talking about oligarchs, they're talking about what he calls the industrialized countries. So even though maybe financialized capitalism can feel so recent for us, can feel like it's something that's just constantly getting worse, I just want to be clear, we have been on this for a minute. And he's saying that what we've been trying, right, what we've already been doing, again, pay attention to the echoes in the present day. Things like trying to elect better candidates, establishing trade unions and co-ops, they haven't been adequate when it comes to achieving our end goal, which is socialism. So he's not saying that these things don't have a use. And in fact, he talks about things like trade unions, things like co-ops in the post-revolutionary period and what their efficacy and what their benefits can be and the purpose that they serve. But for now, he's like, look, guys, if we're going for socialism, it's very clear that this will not lead to that. We've been doing that, okay? So he says that imperialism will always eventually bring the working class to revolution. That's the first contradiction, is between what? Yes, labor and capital. The second contradiction is between financial groups and imperialist powers, right? So the second contradiction is it's kind of like an intra-capital conflict here, because they're fighting over the land and the raw materials that haven't yet been exploited. So yes, there's the labor and capital that are always going to have these huge contradictions. But the second one, especially if you're a working person, might feel more abstract, which is that even the capitalists who you think would have some kind of solidarity, some kind of organization because they have the same aim, actually at a certain point will compete with each other. Why? Because capitalism requires sort of infinite growth, but the resources that they're trying to exploit and extract are finite. Okay, so that's the second one. The third one, he tells us, is the most important. And this is between civilized nations, so-called civilized nations, and third world peoples. He says this one is really important because the point of this exploitation of third world peoples is super profits. But something interesting and kind of unpredictable happens along the way. So as these so-called civilized or colonial countries are extracting the resources, right, along the way, they start doing things that, if you want to hear my hot takes on this, please stick around and join the Patreon so that you can hear the secret speech, because this comes up a lot. He's saying that along the way, while these colonial countries are exploiting what we might call the global south or the underdeveloped world, along the way, they're creating infrastructure, they're building businesses, they're maybe improving or at least differently organizing the schools, and they're starting to catalyze opportunities where these countries themselves, these people themselves develop their own thinkers, theorists, intelligentsia, their own nationalist movements, and this actually is where the opportunity lies. Basically, what he's saying is these are the three main conflicts, and the capitalists themselves create their own enemy.
Yes, to give us a little bit of context to what Stalin is saying here. So if we look at Marx and Engels' work, we can actually see that colonialism was a key focus in their study. We have the English edition, I believe it's called On Colonialism, where while Marx and Engels, on one end, are mainly focusing on studying European economy and the mode of production and the stages in Europe, they're also studying other parts of the world. We've got Marx writings on the Incan mode of production, on what they call the Asiatic mode of production, the African mode of production. And we've got them actually traveling. We've got Marx traveling to Algeria and having a correspondence with Engels and telling him about French colonialism. In Lenin's work, this was something that Lenin was very militant about in the Second International before the break between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And Lenin has quite a few writings on imperialism that Stalin takes in this work. So in these three first contradictions, they actually stem from 5 monopoly forms that Lenin names. So those 5 monopoly forms would be the first one, cartels and syndicates and trusts. The second one, the monopolistic position of the big banks. Monopoly form C would be seizure of the sources of raw material by the trust and financial oligarchy. Monopoly form D would be the economic partition of the world by the international cartels. Monopoly form E would be the territorial partition of the world or the colonies. So these contradictions, labor and capital, would come from the first two. Contradiction 2 between financial groups and imperialist powers would come from the financial oligarchy and the economic partition of the world. And the last one would come from the colonies.
Thank you so much for that. So then he takes these overarching themes, again, because he's saying, okay, you guys are telling me that this only applies to Russia, but when you look at the underlying framework, the presuppositions that go into Leninism as a body of work, as an applied theory, you see that it's actually widely applicable. But he starts with applying it specifically to Russia and the Russian context, which we're going to see obviously a lot in this document. This is important because Marx had always theorized that the revolution might or would be more probable to begin in these sort of like richer or quote unquote more developed countries. And Stalin is saying, no, I totally get why you'd think that. But actually, the place where revolution is most likely isn't necessarily where's most developed. It's actually where the contradictions are the most intense, right? So he's saying Marx assumed that the contradictions would be the most intense where the development was the most intense. And Stalin's saying, that's not necessarily true. So he's like, listen, Tsarist Russia, in this case, had everything bad going for it, right? They had internal struggles. They had external struggles. They had tons of oppression. They had militarization. They had the marginalizing of minority populations. Sound familiar? They were being exploited by the West. And he even says, basically, Russia ends up being like the managerial class of a country in the sense that they're keeping an eye on the East to serve the aims of the West. Russia's in debt to the West. He also says that at this point, Russia had a huge army and that Russian soldiers were fighting and dying for the British and the French already at this point. So basically, Tsarist Russia becomes so intertwined with imperialism. Okay, this is really important to understand. Russia is so intertwined with international imperialism at this point that in order to stand up against the Tsar, you have to stand up against imperialism because they're basically the same thing. At the same time, the peasants, who we're going to talk about a lot, are getting radicalized. So again, going against Marx's assumptions, they weren't what we would call neatly like working class or proletariat. They were the core of the revolution regardless, okay? They also had, in his words, I'll pull a quote here, a real force capable of resolving the contradictions of imperialism in a revolutionary way. So this is an important condition that Russia had. They had a real force capable of resolving the contradictions of imperialism in a revolutionary way. And basically, he's like, it was just a domino effect. It was a perfect storm. Once they realized the weight of imperialism, the revolutionaries want to free the proletarians all over the world. And Russia becomes, right, the sort of de facto center of proletarian revolution with Lenin at the helm. Anyone want to add anything before we go to section 2?
Yes, in contradiction 3, which we said it was the most important one to Stalin, he's proposing a dialectical analysis of the interrelation between imperialism and the colonized independent territories. That's what he calls them. This would inspire anti-colonialist theory in the actual decolonization process that would come after the Second World War. And on the other end of the sword, under what Stalin calls the most barefaced exploitation and the most inhumane oppression of millions of people inhabiting vast colonies and dependent countries. He says these colonies and dependent countries are converted from reserves of imperialism into reserves of the proletarian revolution. At the same time, Stalin interrelates the proletarian revolution to the liberation struggles of the Third World by the time of this text. This is a prelude to decades of support to national liberation struggles on behalf of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point that, again, the theorizing is laid out here, and then we get to see decades, a whole epoch of implementation of these strategies. And like you said, the theoretical and analytical reasons behind them. So coming into section 2, this is the method section. Okay. So to put it very simply, basically, this section is like, listen, guys, this is why the Second International was wrong. And Stalin starts off by warning us against the opportunism of the Second International. If you're wondering what opportunism is, in this case, I'm going to pull a quote from a different document. This is Lenin's Opportunism and the Collapse of the Second International, which was published at the end of 1915, so earlier than this document. The economic basis of social chauvinism, this term being more precise than the term social patriotism, as the latter embellishes the evil, and of opportunism is the same, namely, an alliance between an insignificant section at the top of the labor movement and its own national bourgeoisie. Directed against the masses of the proletariat, an alliance between the servants of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, directed against the class that is exploited by the bourgeoisie. Social chauvinism is a consummated opportunism. Social chauvinism and opportunism are the same in their political essence: class collaboration, repudiation of the proletarian dictatorship, rejection of revolutionary action, obeisance to bourgeois legality, non-confidence in the proletariat, and confidence in the bourgeoisie. And that's a quote again from Lenin's Opportunism and the Collapse of the Second International. So basically, when we're talking about the nature of these opportunists, they're just sort of like comfy cozy, and they think that imperialism can just be overcome by legal means. And he's especially warning us against having what he calls, quote unquote, fragments of theory. Instead of an So this is a quote. Instead of an integral revolutionary theory, there were contradictory theoretical postulates and fragments of theory, which were divorced from the actual revolutionary struggle of the masses, again, that dialectic between theory and practice, and had been turned into threadbare dogmas. For the sake of appearances, Marx's theory was mentioned, of course, but only to rob it of its living revolutionary spirit. He goes on to say that people were using revolutionary slogans, quoting Marx, not doing at all effective self-criticism, and not being trained in correct revolutionary tactics. So then we have this as a sort of background context. He lays out the 4 requirements to apply the Leninist method, and he goes on to compare it to how the Second International basically fell short of this application by falling into dogmatism. So I'm just going to read the 4 steps of Leninism because they're really short and they're really clear. What are the requirements of this method? 1, firstly, the testing of the theoretical dogmas of the Second International in the crucible of the revolutionary struggle of the masses, in the crucible of living practice. Ooh, it's rich. That is to say, the restoration of the broken unity between theory and practice, the healing of the rift between them, right? That's what I said, that dialectic. For only in this way can a truly proletarian party armed with revolutionary theory can be created. 2, secondly, the testing of the policy of the parties of the Second International, not by their slogans and resolutions, which cannot be trusted, but by their deeds, by their actions. For only in this way can the confidence of the proletarian masses be won and deserved. 3, thirdly, the reorganization of all party work on new revolutionary lines with a view to training and preparing the masses for the revolutionary struggle, for only in this way can the masses be prepared for the proletarian revolution. And 4, fourthly, self-criticism within the proletarian parties, their education and training on the basis of their own mistakes, for only in this way can genuine cadres and genuine leaders of the party be trained. Okay, so just to summarize, the first is testing of the theoretical dogmas. The second is the testing of the policy of the parties. The third is the reorganization of party work along the revolutionary lines. And the fourth is self-criticism within the parties. So then he contrasts this, the 4 steps of Leninism, with the shortcomings of the Second International, because they sort of fell again into this dogmatism and failed to apply the 4 steps above. So the first dogma, as he calls it, here cites how the opportunists of the Second International were like, oh no, we need to be the majority. What do we do if the proletarians aren't the majority? And Lenin's like, okay, yeah, sure. Okay, but what if a revolutionary opportunity arises and the proletarians, even if they're a minority, are able to organize effectively around the laboring masses? Shouldn't they just do it? Seems obvious, right? For the second dogma, okay, it's this like weird thing where they're basically like, no, actually, you guys don't understand. We need this is my words, not theirs, but basically like we need a professional managerial class trained under capitalism. Otherwise, we won't know how to like do admin. The workers, they can't do spreadsheets. They can't do admin. And Lenin's like, okay, sure. Or, okay, that's one option. Or rather than having this whole workforce of people who are indoctrinated with these bourgeois ideologies, we could take power first, for example, and just create conditions where cadres can be effectively trained. And this will be way more effective in the long run because they'll be working for the proletarians and not for the capital class. And they'll be getting their sort of class education and their work education at the same time. In the third dogma, they're like, oh, but you guys, Engels said, general strikes are bad, so we can't do one. And Lenin is like, okay, so that is actually not what Engels had said. He said one specific kind of strike was bad. The economic general strike, which was advocated for by the anarchists. But an economic general strike is not the same thing as the political general strike. So he's like, no, that's not what Engels had said. Then he asks this series of rhetorical questions, which are really sassy. So actually, I just like recommend that you read them because they're good. But basically, he's like, whatever works, we can do some parliamentary reform in the short term as long as we keep our sights set on the revolution, right? So he's reminding us here explicitly that Lenin said, revolutionary theory is not dogma. And that, like any theory, it needs to be applied and analyzed. Otherwise, it's not really anything. It's not meaningful at all. It's just a meme. He also gives us this kind of spicy take here, reminding us that slapping like a revolutionary sounding slogan on something doesn't make it a revolutionary movement. Listen to me, all of you chronically online people. Slapping a revolutionary sounding slogan on something does not a revolutionary moment make. And it does not necessarily have revolutionary potential. And again, we can measure the extent to which a phrase or writing is revolutionary against the impact of the actions taken as a result. So the slogan by itself doesn't mean anything. What are the actions that the masses were moved to take as a result? That's how we know whether or not it was so-called revolutionary. Finally, he underlines one more time the importance of correctly self-criticizing as a party and explaining how the Second International is basically just like, okay, actually, we've internally reviewed ourselves and actually discovered that we didn't do anything wrong. We're awesome. Thanks. We end this section, and Stalin states here, I want to leave you with this quote before I open it to anyone else's contributions. It would be wrong to suppose that Lenin's method is merely the restoration of the method of Marx. As a matter of fact, Lenin's method is not only the restoration of, but also the concretization and further development of the critical and revolutionary theory of Marx, of his materialist dialectics. Yeah, before we move on, anyone have thoughts on section 2 on method?
I have a few thoughts on criticism and self-criticism. So I have a few quotes here the first one is from Stalin from this book. He says, self-criticism within the proletarian parties, their education and training on the basis of their own mistakes, for only in this way can genuine cadres and genuine leaders of the party be trained. This is in page 17. Then I've got a quote from Mao Zedong, implementing a bit of Eastern philosophy. So Mao says, dust will accumulate if a room is not cleaned regularly. Our faces will get dirty if they're not washed regularly. Our comrades' minds and our work may also collect dust. Here he says our party work. And also may need sweeping and washing. This is On Coalition Government, Selected Works, Volume 3, page 316. And then if we've got time for one more, I've got one from Ho Chi Minh. He says, collective leadership... I
always have time for Ho Chi Minh.
He says, collective leadership should be on par with individual responsibility. Democratic principles should be broadened. Self-criticism and criticism, especially criticism from below, should be widespread. We should always take into account the prevailing conditions and maintain close contact to the masses. This is in the speech closing the 9th enlarged session of the Central Committee of the Vietnam Workers' Party in 1956.
So we move into the third section. This is the theory section. There's basically 3 main points that are brought up in this section. The first is the importance of theory. The second is spontaneity and kind of the worship of spontaneity. And the third is proletarian revolution. So first, he's like, I don't know why these haters just keep saying Lenin wasn't a theorist, which, by the way, is like hilarious to me because also, right, people say Stalin wasn't a theorist and that Stalin didn't write good, even though, by the way, he's writing this like whole thing in not his native language. And Marx is seen as one of the great theorists of communism, obviously, but that's largely a result of Lenin and other people's contributions. And Lenin being seen as a great theorist is largely a result of Stalin's contribution. So once again, the reminder of like how much theory and philosophy are gatekept from revolutionaries and from working people, even by those who claim to be sort of like in favor of both, right? So on this, he says, theory is the experience of the working class movement in all countries taken in its general aspect. Of course, theory becomes purposeless if it is not connected with revolutionary practice, just as practice gropes in the dark if its path is not illuminated by revolutionary theory. But theory can become a tremendous force in the working class movement if it is built up in indissoluble connection with revolutionary practice. For theory and theory alone can give the movement confidence, the power of orientation, and an understanding of the inner relation of surrounding events. For it and it alone can help practice to realize not only how and in which direction classes are moving at the present time, but also how and in which direction they will move in the near future. So he's basically like, babes, without theory, we're groping in the dark and not in the fun way. It's wild to think that Lenin didn't value theory. He does. We do. Period. He also points out that while Lenin was doing work to connect Marxist theory to the time in which he was living, citing specifically materialism and empirio-criticism, those are two pieces of Lenin's work that you can read, that Lenin's biggest critics on the subject of theory never did anything like that. So Lenin is actively producing theory while his haters who do not produce theory are like, oh, he is not a theorist. That is so crazy. They were literally just being haters while Lenin was literally doing theory. So the second point, we get into the so-called theory of spontaneity, which Stalin says is a theory of, you guessed it, opportunism and trade unionism. And that it's the line of least resistance, which if you're trying for revolution, I mean, you're going to need more than the least resistance, right? You're going to need like the most resistance, right? And he also points out that there's something really important, which is that worshiping spontaneity completely minimizes and erases the value of consciousness within a movement. He was like, these so-called economists peddle this shit and ultimately surrender their power to the will of the bourgeoisie. Kind of the Lemony Snicket's quote, right? Like if you're waiting for the right moment to happen, we'll be waiting for the rest of our lives kind of thing.
Stalin also talks about the productive forces theory here. He says that for the Second International in this line of opportunism, what the Second International is waiting on, they think of reform first, and they're waiting on the proletariat to get large enough so that it can do the revolution. But first they want to reform their way there. Stalin says the so-called productive forces theory is debased by the leaders of the Second International. It justifies everything and conciliates everybody.
Yeah. And I think weirdly, this is where Stalin and Trotsky are in agreement. There's a quote by Trotsky where he's talking about the NEP, and he says that revolutionaries may accede to reformism, but only after they have taken state power, basically. Once they have control of the government, then they can institute reforms which are not necessarily socialist in nature, but which are beneficial to the economy, but they're not going to attempt to access those reforms prior to having control of the government, because it's like a fucking, content warning. I didn't mean to quote Trotsky at y'all without a warning, but that's, I mean, they are in agreement on this matter.
Well, I think that that's actually a really important contribution, Jeremy, because it reminds us, again, I mean, obviously Mao writes on length about this, but understanding the nature of the different varied types of conflict and contradiction. And we live in this incredibly hyperpolarized world where it's like, oh, well, if somebody that I don't like thinks that, then I definitely just think the opposite because they must be wrong on every point. And that's not really true. And this kind of work demands a lot of nuance, a lot of critical thinking, a lot of an ability and a willingness to highlight the sameness of people's arguments, as well as to be able to carve out their differences. And kind of why I was saying at the beginning of this, the purpose of this is to identify the specifically Leninist characteristics of what we could call Leninism in collaboration with and in contrast to other prevailing tendencies of the time, which, to your point, Jeremy, I think is still really important today. We actually might have certain things that we agree with in parties or people or organizations on the whole that we vehemently disagree with.
Certainly, yeah.
You can't have slaves unless you have slave holders. You can't have serfs unless you have lords. You can't have lords unless you have serfs. You can't have employers unless you have employees. You can't have plutocrats and capitalists unless you have workers.
The Little Yellow Book, quotations from Michael Parenti, compiled in collaboration between Anti-Imperialist Parenti Posting and the Marxist-Leninist Reading Hub, is a compendium of his published works and lectures. One of the most outstanding minds of our time in the fields of political analysis, imperialism and extraction from the global south, socialist movements around the world and the dissection of fascism. A showcase of his ability to take complex topics and break them down in a didactic political pedagogy. Crucial reading for any socialist in the imperial periphery or the imperial core likewise.
And in fact, these areas are not poor, they're rich in resources. This explains why Walter Rodney titled his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That is, he used the word underdeveloped as a verb. In country after country, when European and North American investment came in, the people did not become more prosperous. They ended up becoming poorer.
You can read the free digital copy or a physical copy for just $8 plus shipping at mlreadinghub.org/books. The proceeds of this book will go to the Michael Parenti Political Archive and Popular Education in Latin America.
We're not criticizing America. It's our home too. We're criticizing policymakers who are doing things that are damaging America. Either you own the mother or you work for it.
So coming into the next piece here, it's so exciting because, baby, we have the theory of proletarian revolution, which Stalin says proceeds from three fundamental theses. The first, domination of finance capital in quote-unquote advanced capitalist countries, using stocks and bonds as principal operations of finance capital. And here's a big one. One of the main pillars of imperialism here is that, this is a quote, the export of capital to the sources of raw materials. Okay. So like basically exploited countries are being exploited for their raw materials. Timber, minerals, oil, etc. But then the final capital, what those things are used to create, is valued way higher than the raw materials and then sold back to the people of these countries. I mean, and to people within empire, but basically sold back to the people in these countries to not only further exploit them financially, both for profit and by robbing them of the chance to industrialize themselves or, evolve however they would have evolved independently of imperialism and capitalism. That's the first thesis, domination of finance capital and the sort of exploitation of third world peoples and countries. Two, basically colonialism metastasizing globally. This converts what we would have previously thought of or tried to analyze independent economies to a global economy consisting basically of colonizers and colonized. And so rather than thinking about capitalism in one country, we just have to see it as the intricately woven global quagmire that it is, which by the way, I think also further supports both the theory and obviously the lived reality that it's where the contradictions feel the most intense that revolution becomes most possible and not just the development. Because although, right, we live in a time with like very strict immigration laws, although the restriction of movement of people might give you the illusion that different countries or economies are somehow separate, when we're actually looking at the movement of materials, at the movement of the means of production, at the movement of capital and money and finance itself, we can see that it's not really important to examine the conditions of just one country in isolation if you're not also examining how that sort of fits into the larger global puzzle. Okay. And the third thesis is about inter-capitalist conflict as the capitalists and the aspiring capitalists continuously scramble to redivide the world. Joel mentioned this earlier, due to uneven development and the need to extract more profits, right? So this leads to inter-capitalist struggles, which actually weakens, this is great, this is where we can do something about it. So this inter-capitalist struggle actually weakens the power of imperialism, right? This is one of the big contradictions that Stalin was talking about before, just in a slightly different way. And this weakens the power of the imperialist class and creates opportunities for proletarians to struggle against it.
It's very important to think about what was the context at this time and how possibly 2/3 of the world were under colonial rule. And as Stalin, he talks about being pregnant with revolution. Russia was pregnant with revolution, etc. And I think the world was starting to be pregnant with what world would come after 1945. When he's speaking about the Second International just before here, it's actually quite close to what part of the capitalist world shifts to, which is social democracy. And in the US, it's Keynesianism and the productive capitalism and imperialism that Lenin talked about, which perhaps doesn't look so much like the neoliberal post-fall of the USSR world that we live today. And also, when Stalin is talking about liberation of colonial colonized and dependent countries, he's already starting to introduce us to the theory of unequal development, which would be further developed in the decades to come by different third world or even some Marxist writers, as well as when Stalin talks about national consciousness, and he puts national consciousness in this struggle at the forefront before class consciousness. So at this point, we're moving on from class consciousness onto something new, which, as maybe before Marxism was a sort of universal theory, Stalin is trying to shift us into a national theory for Marxism. And then we see inspirations of this in non-Marxist writings like Frantz Fanon. A big subject of Frantz Fanon's work is what is the national consciousness, what is the national rhythm, and how is this a factor in the liberation movement of the third world peoples?
Which, again, we get into in section 5. So if you were like, if you're listening and you're like, isn't this that document where they talk about the national question? Sure is. We'll get to it in just a minute here.
And it's spicy.
It's so spicy. And all of this that we said before, right? So the 3 fundamental theses of proletarian revolution, again, we're talking about the exploitation in the first one. In the second one, we're talking about the sort of metastasizing of colonization globally, which I think Joel just spoke really brilliantly on. And then the third is this thesis of intercapitalist conflict, also something that Joel was adding to previously, this like intercapitalist struggle as the resources and extraction intensifies and people have to constantly shuffle to find more and more and more. And this creates the opportunity for the proletarians to struggle against it, right? Because as these capitalist powers are starting to fight against each other, they're distracted. Just in a very literal sense, they're distracted and trying to fight against each other to the point where they're not able to cohesively maintain power.
I think it's really funny how at this point Stalin is telling us that Lenin was like, come on guys, like the war already happened, it's going to happen again, and it's going to happen soon. And it seems like Stalin really listened to that.
That's such a good insight. And so then just to end that little chunk by quoting Lenin to say that imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution. And to that, Stalin adds, quote, the very approach to the question of the proletarian revolution, of the character of the revolution, of its scope, of its depth, the scheme of the revolution in general changes accordingly. Yeah, so he's saying that, again, before, you could examine the conditions in one country, but now you can't really do that because of the nature of globalization. And so he sees it as identifying and attacking the link of imperial power where it's the weakest, not necessarily where the population, again, is the most advanced or the richest or the strongest, right? A little bit further down in this section, I don't want to skip too much, but honestly, we still have, I think, like 6 more sections. We get to something that I really do want to touch on. Ooh, it's spicy, everyone. Take your antacid pills, because it's Stalin summarizing Lenin's response to the theory of permanent revolution. And so understanding the Leninist position on this is a really definitive feature of the Marxist-Leninist line. So why did Lenin oppose permanent revolution? First, the permanent revolution actually misunderstands and devalues the importance of the peasantry and their role in revolution. Okay, this is really key, because if you're just passively consuming these thoughts and these theories and these buzzwords, you might hear the words permanent revolution and go, I don't know, that kind of sounds like intuitively like it could be important. And Lenin agrees with that. He agrees with the basic premise of what is called in this document uninterruptedness of revolution. But where the disagreement, where the rupture occurs is in the devaluation of the contributions of the peasantry as a part of the revolutionary movement and as a people with revolutionary potential, which we are going to get into in just a minute here. The permanentists take something that both Marx and Lenin broadly agree with, but basically they just make it unfit for implementation on the basically the necessary conditions to overthrow the bourgeoisie, and he is pulling from ideas that are in left-wing communism. So it's not enough, basically, that the exploited are just passively aware of how shitty their lives are. You also need, so it's not enough, right? So, okay, working people know that their lives are shitty, but that's not enough. You also need the bourgeois or the upper classes to be unable to carry on ruling and exploiting and extracting the way that they have been. So like we need a nationwide or even a global crisis. Workers need to understand that revolution is necessary. And frankly, they need to be really willing to die. Like they need to risk it for the biscuit, for the cause. At the same time that the ruling classes are in the midst of a governmental crisis. And then all while this is happening, the Revolutionary Party needs to establish a socialist government. And they need support from the other countries trying to do the same thing, right? They need to be supporting each other. If you're sort of pre-revolution, you need to be making relationships with other revolutionary projects. If you listen to our episode on Rev Left, Tony has some pretty strong feelings about this. And right here, Stalin is saying this is vital. This is another thing that I want to lay out here that I think is really important in this section. For a lot of us in the West in these times, and maybe also in other countries, depending on where you're listening, there can be a tendency for sort of idealistic leftists or so-called communists to want to skip over this. Lenin and then Stalin are not saying you can just have the revolution whenever you want, as long as you're just a party who's willing to call for revolution. He's saying, actually, we, as the revolutionary force, cannot create the conditions for revolution. Capitalism is going to do that on its own. We, as revolutionaries, our role is to correctly be able to identify and respond when those conditions have been created. Before we move on to the next section, anyone got anything?
I can talk about Trotskyism in Argentina.
Yes, please.
So this actually applies. I think it can be applied to a certain part of our reality here in Argentina. So we have a very big Trotskyist movement here. It's even bigger than anything that could be considered Marxist-Leninist for Argentina. And the center of this Trotskyist movement, just like Stalin is explaining here long before it existed here in Argentina, is that it is centered around the worker that is in formal employment, who's under formal employment. So what Stalin here is saying that they leave out the peasant class, but in the current day, for the people who are unemployed, who are underemployed, who are third-party contractors, who work in cooperatives, who are campesinos and not necessarily European peasants or other rural workers, the informal workers, sex workers, lumber proletarians, some petite bourgeois, all of them are left out. So in the Trotskyist discourse in Argentina, it parts from the workers. The workers is the beginning of every single campaign slogan that they have, basically. But it doesn't represent the vast majority of the people in Argentina when 60% of the population are below the poverty line, and we have a rampant unemployment and all these problems.
Which again is exactly what they're saying here. Like, yeah, sure. This is literally, you know how one of those like zingers people are always like, ooh, communism, good in theory, poor in practice. They're not talking about communism. They're talking about that. You've taken something that is true, left out a bunch of people, and therefore rendered it unable to actually be applied in any meaningful way. And so this is going to come up a lot more. Thank you, Joel, for that contribution, because it comes up a lot more in sections 4 and 6. So section 4, we're moving into dictatorship, big dictatorship of the proletariat energy.
Yes.
Yes. Like all millennials, Stalin loves the listicle, so he starts this section with 1, 2, and the 3 points are: A, the dictatorship of the proletariat as the instrument. Think about this. This takes a little bit of like conceptual thinking. The dictatorship of the proletariat as the instrument of the proletarian revolution. B, the dictatorship of the proletariat as the rule of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. So he's identifying a relationship here. And C, Soviet power. Tony told us at the top what Soviet was. Soviet power as the state form. This is so important. This is a new conceptualization of the state that I think is still really, really hard for people to grasp. Soviet power as the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay? So we're going to go into that piece by piece. Number 1. Dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, you can do a revolution without this. Lenin admits that, but it's not going to succeed. You can like do a revolutionary thing. You can do an insurrection, but it's not going to succeed. Like it's not going to lead you to, again, we just have one end goal here, right? Is socialism. It's not going to lead you to socialism. Getting power is just the beginning. Then you need to do a few things. The first thing that you need to do is break the resistance of the landlords and the capitalists to stop all of their efforts to try to restore their power. You need to organize construction in a way that rallies people around the proletariat and the abolition of class, right? Because again, in the immediate post-revolutionary period, we still all of the same material conditions exist. So we still have classes. And so we need to be rallying people around the proletariat and around the movement toward abolition of class. And finally, you need to arm the revolution against foreign enemies. He talks more about the sad bourgeois and how they still have the resources. So this is why they're a threat, right? You're well, we've won. We're the dictatorship of the proletariat. We just did a revolution. No, because the sad, disaffected bourgeois, they still have all of their access to foreign connections, to foreign capital. They have all of the privileges that they had before. And now they have the resentment to continue to mount challenges against the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? He points out that the front line of struggle, and I love this. I have spoken about this in several of our episodes. He points out that the front line of struggle here is literally everywhere. In education, in the sphere of the family, in the social, in armed conflict, in every single aspect of personal and political life. That it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? The front line of struggle is absolutely anywhere you are. And yes, we're going to make progress. And yes, we're going to have to backtrack. And yes, we're going to rethink it. And it's messy. And during this whole period, you need to continue to self-criticize. You need to re-educate the masses. You need to know who to work with. Because again, as Joel said previously, there are even some petty bourgeois people. And this document gives us a little bit of a sense of there are some of them that you can and should be slowly, intentionally, tentatively, while thinking critically, maybe building relationships with. And you need to know who to work with, how slow or fast you can go. He says there could be decades of war, of conflict, of resistance. And this period, though, this is the period, right? So this is another thing. I'm going to be honest, this is one of those moments that really stands out in terms of a feature of ML as a tendency, especially in the present day, is, there are so many different people, so many different tendencies that say, oh, can't we just take the power back? Can't we just dissolve the state? We could just do this. It would be so great. And what Stalin is saying here is actually this period, this post-revolutionary period of changing the nature of your relationships, of shifting people's consciousness around the abolition of class, the struggle, the war, the conflict. This period is a crucible. This is an alchemical period almost. That is actually, these are the conditions. This is the fire that is necessary to sort of forge the population who is then able to maintain and handle and sustain socialism. So he's saying, no, even if we wanted to, we can't, because you can't just wake up and do a socialism. You actually need this period of time that fundamentally changes the population as individuals and collectively over a period of decades, because the people that we are now do not have the consciousness, do not have the patterning, do not have the relational sensibility to be able to maintain and sustain socialism. So I think that's really important. It's a really key feature of the Marxist-Leninist tendency. Coming into step 2, the dictatorship of the proletariat as the rule over the bourgeoisie. So as I said before, we're shifting a relationship here. We're shifting a power dynamic here. So he's also okay, I gotta be clear, everyone. This isn't the same system we have, but just with hip and cool politicians, right? This isn't a squad moment. That's just a screen. That whole thing where they give us the crumbs, where they give us hip, cool politicians, where they do some reforms, that's just a screen, is the word he uses, that covers the ugliness, the vileness, the sourness of the actual face of imperialism. So he's no. We're not here to just put new faces in high places, right? The government of capital with a new face, right? That's not what we're trying to deliver. What we're looking for here is a different structure altogether. You are destroying basically the parasite state, right? The fundamental circumstances that we have now is the state functions as a parasite, leeching off of us, extracting resources, extracting labor, and we're replacing it with a new state that ensures the establishment of socialism. So yes, it is a state, but it has a different purpose than the imperial colonial state. So this challenges the sort of like anarchist notion, by the way, of a sort of like anti-state at all cost. And I want to point out here, something that I see often is called sort of like anti-state Marxism. And while again, Marx wasn't doing a Marxism, I personally cannot imagine he'd be very pleased with this because Marx and Engels absolutely understood the value of the state. And more than that, are responding to the material conditions that they are in, which is that there are states. Period, right? We're not building socialism from scratch, from neutral, from a clean slate. We're building it from our material conditions. And there are states and there are militaries. So we have to be willing and able to respond to those realities, whether or not you like them.
This was a writing in political education really from the Soviet Union to the rest of the world. And it didn't just inspire communist movements or socialist movements that are Marxist or Marxist-Leninist. The use of the term instrument of revolution, we can find that in the governing party of Bolivia, the movement towards socialism. The full name is actually MAS, which is Movimiento al Socialismo, IPSP, which would be the political instrument for the sovereignty of the peoples. So what Lenin defines as Soviet power goes into his theory of dual power. And the theory of dual power has also been used in movements that haven't been strictly Marxist-Leninist or strictly Marxist. We can see that what was developed as Black Power by the Black Panther Party in the United States is the way it's put forward. It is like a dual power, but instead between a colonized people and a settler colonial state. And the Black Panthers were not formally Marxist-Leninists. They were not Marxist-Leninists openly. They did not say, we are a Marxist-Leninist party. Yet they were inspired by things like dual power. And also we see the way that Stalin and Lenin describe this political structure of democratic centralism. We can see that it's applied in the non-Soviet socialist world, which would be the third world countries that had Marxist-Leninist governments like Cuba, Vietnam, China, North Korea, DPRK, sorry. These are all proposals from Stalin for the Leninist movement to inspire even outside that movement, even to those who don't strictly coincide with us on doctrinal terms, that these are all tools that can be used in reality.
He comes into another point about democracy. Ooh, this ruffles the feathers. This ruffles the feathers because he is like, basically, this cannot be a complete democracy. Because if it's a complete democracy, that means it's for the rich as well as the poor. That's not true. It's a new democracy. It's dictatorial against the bourgeoisie. It's not pure. It's not perfect. And those who project those ideals are actually just bourgeois in disguise. And so we've got a quote here. He says, democracy under capitalism is capitalist democracy. And democracy of the exploiting minority based on the restriction of the rights of exploited majority and directed against this majority. Only under the proletarian dictatorship are real liberties for the exploited and real participation of the proletarians and peasants in governing the country possible. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, democracy is proletarian democracy. Again, he's saying we're living in capitalist democracy, but under the dictatorship of the proletariat, democracy is proletarian democracy, the democracy of the exploited majority, based on the restrictions of the rights of the exploiting minority and directed against this minority. So he also says plainly here that it's just not peaceful. You have to smash, you have to destroy the police state, the army, the bourgeois bureaucratic apparatus, and so on.
When it comes to counter-revolutionary emigres, whether it's, Cubans living in Miami or, when the Soviet Union was around, say, for example, Estonian immigrants in Canada, their gripes with the Soviet Union or with Cuba, for example, had to do with dictatorship of the proletariat. That's what upset them the most, because it was that dictatorship which was taking their land and redistributing it to the people, right? It was that dictatorship which removed them from their positions of power. And so I just want to kind of highlight that it is what the bourgeois fear the most.
It is the feather ruffler. I said it. It ruffles the feathers. As we get into part 3, right, Soviet power as the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Again, this is a new conceptualization of our understanding of the state and its potential and the purpose that it can serve. Basically, he's like, how do we put capitalism in its fucking grave? And what are the characteristics of the Soviets? So number one, this comes back to the things that we're saying before, embrace all workers. So this means, by the way, guys, like not judging the baristas, not hating on the truckers, but just being the most welcoming. So there are ways in which, and we define this later in the document, especially when we get into the function of the party, we're not welcoming everyone, but we're not excluding anyone just based off of what kind of worker they are. We're willing to engage with any and all workers, but just being the most welcoming, especially during the period where classes still exist. Two, they're the most democratic. Again, a specific kind of democracy, because it's always a specific kind of democracy. And therefore, they're authoritative because they've earned it, right? They get their authority through the democracy and through meeting the needs of, or attempting to meet the needs of the most different kinds of people. The third, the union of local Soviets organized into common organization, right? So if all we're doing is co-ops, if all we're doing is trade unions where we are, and they're not a part of, they're sort of like spokes off the wheel of this central common organization. So four, the most revolutionary. So this is something that I'm going to be honest, I think makes maybe some of us uncomfortable, even if we don't want to admit it. Because there's a point post-revolution where, like me, for example, like I'm not that valuable anymore, right? I've done my time, I've explained some ideas, and I'm no longer the most revolutionary, right? That transition toward the most revolutionary force and always ensuring that the central focus and purpose of this sort of Soviet power as the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat is centered on and anchored by the most revolutionary forces. And then point five. He also points out how this educates workers on governance so that eventually they can destroy the old state apparatus. All right, we're about halfway through the document. Section 5, the peasant question, baby. So a lot of folks sort of skip this one, assuming like, I don't know any peasants, so it's not relevant. But I really, really disagree. And first of all, there are still campesinos or rural workers in much of the world, but also I invite you to take what we're discussing in this section and apply it to other groups who don't fit neatly in the category of worker under capitalism. Joel spoke on this before, I think really, really brilliantly. Two examples that I can think of would be, for example, like a so-called surplus population of disabled people, like me. Or for those of you who listen to the Ecuador episode, the indigenous folks in the Amazon, right? They're not living under capitalism in the same way that many of us are or that anyone does in like a city. But the aims of proletarian revolution positively benefit these people, and we should see them as potential allies with revolutionary power all the same. So basically, he's reflecting on the peasantry, both during the revolution and also after the consolidation of Soviet power. So because so many, again, had sort of devalued the role of the peasants before, people are like, oh, right, the Leninists, they are just peasant lovers or whatever. And Stalin is like, no, we're not just like peasant lovers for the sake of loving peasants. The central question of Leninism isn't the question of the peasantry. The central question of Leninism is about the dictatorship of the proletariat, how we can do it and how we can consolidate power. But the peasant question is still really important. We're not the ones misunderstanding the peasants, y'all are. And he's plainly like, y'all don't care about the peasants because you actually don't want revolution. Like, it's so ironic that 10 minutes ago, all you guys were like, oh my God, we need to be the majority. But then when you aren't the majority, you're not willing to look at other people who might unite and ally with your cause. Why? Why don't you do that? Why are you like, no, they don't count? Because you don't actually want the revolution. You want to pontificate on the revolution. You want to postulate about the revolution, but you don't actually want it to happen because it threatens your position. Something else that honestly, I think makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's nonetheless true. Stalin's like, look, it comes down to this. Does the peasantry have revolutionary potential? Check yes or no. And Lenin is like, hell yes, circling it in red pen. So now in Lenin's time, there were totally privileged or rich people in the peasantry, and they were not on the side of workers. Does anyone want to say anything about like the peasant sort of like class or sort of parallel existence as a whole during this time?
Yeah, so something that Stalin says is basically there is revolutionary potential within the peasants because of their relationship to the bourgeoisie largely, or the government itself. There's a certain amount of their wealth that's being taken away from them, but it's not done in a it's like semi-feudal. It's a weird, I'm not going to get into the economics of it, but they want freedom from exploitation and domination just like the proletariat do. However, he's they do have individualist and backward sort of social tendencies as well, so we can't just bring them on and onboard their ideas. What we need to do is let's work together to get this revolution done, and then we will help to re-educate them so that they can get rid of their individualist tendencies and move towards a collectivist identity in the future. And again, peasants are not a dominant economic force really anywhere in the West, probably not really anywhere in the world if we're going to go by the sort of basic definition of what a European peasant is. But there are lots of classes that are not necessarily proletarian that we can use those same thoughts and ideas, those same theoretical frameworks to address. There is revolutionary potential everywhere. I think, at least on an individual case-by-case basis, you can say, okay, this group over here, the professional managerial class, does not have a huge amount of revolutionary potential, but there are likely members of the PMC who would like to exist in an economy where they are not the go-between between the bourgeoisie and the worker. You know what I mean? I am certain there are many, many members of the PMC who would prefer to be in an equitable society where they might have an administrative role as a go-between between the dictatorship of the proletariat as a Soviet power structure and the central committee. I don't know. I'm getting into the weeds here, but I suppose the point here is that although workers were the focus of many, many, many other tendencies of the left, and of course, obviously, they are a significant part of Marxist-Leninist theory, they are not the only class, and we should not solely focus on the proletariat. We should be looking at ways we can radicalize or onboard members of other classes and subclasses, I think.
Yeah, for sure. He's shock and awe. You actually have to analyze things on a case-by-case basis.
To simplify the concept, because if we think about the world of work, it is quite complex. And we've got loads of subcategories and some things we might call classes, other things we might call social forces. But it's quite simple to think about when you think about the difference between what is a worker in a general sense and what is a proletarian in a particular sense, as someone who works for the bourgeoisie in an employment situation. So the difference between what is a worker and what is an employee. An employee is quite specific, could be in one industry or another, but it would always be that worker, employer-employee relation. But for the worker in the general sense, that fits a whole world of people that perhaps in some countries they don't have a majority proletarian population like it is in 80% of the world that works directly on a formal basis as an employee with the rights of each particular country and everything. So I think that's where they're marking the difference here with the peasant question, that they're also part of it. And what Stalin and Lenin warn about is that when they're talking about the 1904 revolution and then the two revolutions in 1917, that Lenin's talking about the two tactics, which is how the first revolution in 1917, the bourgeois revolution, would catapult the working classes or the social forces in Russia into a second revolution. In the first one, the bourgeois revolution, it was the bourgeoisie who had rounded up, guess who? The peasantry, to overthrow the current regime of things somewhat. And what happens in the second revolution in 1917 is that the peasants rally around the proletariat as well as other categories of workers.
And I think that we see, like devastatingly shocking parallels to that today, that basically what you guys are both describing is there is this kind of like parallel economy that falls in this document under the peasant question. But there are all kinds of people in informal or semi-formal or different kinds of labor. And basically they're sort of like at the mercy of these two different sort of classes, and they can be won over to the side of the proletariat, or they could be won over to the side of capitalists, right? We see that today with like, oh, you're being exploited, like just, start your own business or whatever. And that's a way in which a lot of disenfranchised informal workers or people who can't easily or readily be classified as workers get sort of like tempted into this sort of pro-capitalist thinking because they don't identify neatly with either of those two sort of main classes, and their consciousness and their desires are kind of like all up for debate.
We can see manifestations of this today. For example, I've got this book that I got. It's an old 1970s edition from Argentina. It's a Kim Il-sung book. And he talks about, it's called Revolutionary Thought. He talks about the people's economy, and he's talking about this, articulating this whole sector of the economy that accounts for the majority in most third world countries and organizing it and creating a self-run chain of production. Because at the end of the day, what all of these other categories of workers are doing, whether they're organized or not, is that they are producing their own sustenance, because they're not being paid a salary on an employment basis necessarily. And we can see this reflected in China. What we hear mostly about China on the news or on most platforms is about China's private sector and China's public sector, which I understand goes greatly. But 30% of the Chinese economy is what they consider the people's economy, which includes China's worker cooperatives, which China is the country with the most worker cooperatives in the world. And these worker cooperatives that Chinese workers have, they articulate economically with worker cooperatives all over the world from all different countries. And this is an application of the peasant question.
And also, which we get into later in the document, the purpose that trade unions and cooperatives can serve in the post-revolutionary period. Because again, like he says at the top, it's not that they're useless, it's just that they don't achieve socialism. He goes on to talk first about the peasantry during the first bourgeois democratic revolution, 1905 to 1917. This is categorized by the peasants turning away from the bourgeois and toward the Bolsheviks, right? So many of us have given evidence and reasons and thoughts about this, but basically it's just because the bourgeoisie was weakening as a class. And at that point, they're just trying to save their own asses. They're not interested in or able to lift up or ally with other kinds of people, right? So when the peasants realize what eventually all proletarian or proletarianizable people realize is that the bourgeois are totally going to fuck them over. And when they realize that, they're not going to get any kind of land, they're not going to get any kind of wealth if we let these guys win. They were just going to be exploited and abandoned like everyone else. So basically, even though, again, as Joel has mentioned before, that's not their reality, right now in that moment, they realize, holy shit, it's going to be. Because even though we see ourselves as peasants, as this separate class of people, the bourgeois still see us as workers or future potential workers, not as part of the owning class. So basically, here we are aspiring to be like one of them, but they never plan to see us or accept us as part of the owning class. Well, fuck. So then they slowly begin to develop the alliance with the proletarian class. And because of this, the Russian Revolution had a lot of momentum, and the two revolutions happened relatively quickly, right? He compares this to the conditions of revolution in Britain, France, Germany, and Austria, where proletarians didn't have that kind of power. So though the peasants are still liberated from feudalism, kind of what Jeremy was talking about before, right? It's not like we all like wake up, clean slate, new year, new me, new mode of production, right? Even as we move into capitalism, we still have these vestiges of feudalism. Even as we move towards socialism, again, in the immediate post-revolutionary period, there are still classes. So there are all sort of these like echoes of these different modes of production. when the other countries sort of failed revolutions in their example, what we can learn, though the peasants are still liberated from feudalism, it happens because of the bourgeoisie, right? Which is different than the realization, than this sort of like this nascent class consciousness that the peasants have in Russia. And so since the peasants in these other examples see the bourgeoisie as the liberatory force, they're more likely to be loyal to them. Versus in Russia, where they're like, oh, you guys hate us. And so we understand that even if we see ourselves as having the potential to be on our side, on your side, you never see us that way, right? And so that's a unique thing, a unique condition in the Russian example that wasn't present in other similar examples. And that's why, again, it's really important. The peasant question is a really important question, or as we can say in our discussion today, the like informal working sector, or those who are underemployed, or those who are unemployable for myriad reasons. What we do with them, how we ally with them. I mean, I say with them, like I'm part of this class, but you know, how the dictatorship of the proletariat is interested in relating to this group of people is vitally important in terms of how this group understands themselves and how they see themselves as relating to the other class, and how they're able to recognize their own sort of revolutionary potential. So Stalin concludes that the class struggle is what advanced and what makes revolution possible, right? Compared to the idea, again, that the development of the individual country would need to be advanced for the revolution. Then there's a few things that are specific contributing factors, and they're pretty interesting for our work today. See if you can find any similarities. One, more than half of all the workers were working for really large monopoly companies. Two, the increasing militarization against the population radicalized people and united them against the capital and owner class, because they start to realize that the cops and the military are in alignment with the owner class. And three, I don't know where I've seen this before, extreme exploitation from landlords. Okay, so then when we look at the peasantry in the inner class period, which is really just like 8 months, Stalin calls them 8 months of revolution. And this period is basically where, quote unquote, both sides, as Joel has said, laid out so beautifully just a minute ago, like there's actually kind of several facets to the fight, but for the purpose of this analysis, we're saying kind of both sides fight for the support of the peasants. And essentially the entire population is like, let's get out of the war. But again, in order to get out of the war, we have to overthrow the bourgeoisie, and basically showing the peasants that they were never going to be able to get, quote unquote, land and liberty from the bourgeoisie in power, because in the end, the bourgeoisie are the same as the cadets. They're on the same side, except they just use like woke rhetoric, right? Like, where have you heard that before? Like you're trying to choose, peasants, you're trying to choose between two options and they look really different, but one of them is just like using woke slogans and the other one isn't, but actually maybe they're like the same. When they realize this, they shift their alliance as a whole, the peasantry, and become more amenable to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, again, the peasants, as Jeremy kind of mentioned before, they have their own kind of class structure. And so when I'm saying the peasantry as a whole, I'm saying many of the peasants, because there are still peasants who are effectively more kind of like petty bourgeois, like they're rich peasants. And these people may not have been in alignment, right? So there's no group that's a monolith anywhere. We're just having this basic understanding of these ideas. Then after the 1917 revolution, the objective shifts, right? So at every stage of the revolution, we do get into this more in the document, there's like kind of a different strategy and then different tactics that are used to achieve that strategy at play. So after the 1917 revolution, the objective shifts, and the purpose of this kind of season is to consolidate Soviet power. During this time, haters are still like, the peasants can't really help us and we can't really help them. And Lenin and Stalin are like, no, girl, shut up. First of all, these peasants are incredibly knowledgeable because they've been through several revolutions, and their own lived experience, their own analysis, their own knowledge base has served as their education. Second, there's an undercurrent here that is never explicitly said, but I think it's of great importance to us today, which is that the Bolsheviks never saw any group of people, like in general, in terms of their potentiality, as disposable. Anyone who was willing to be educated, and like I said, Stalin gives us examples of when we have to go slowly, when we have to tread carefully. Anyone who's willing to be educated can be educated and ally themselves with the proletarian cause. Obviously, Engels is quoted at length here. Engels himself is like a man of means, right? Talking about how he supports what he calls the small peasant, and how he thinks it's worth it to prioritize their well-being and support them even while they are are still peasants, before their consciousness has totally crystallized, knowing that eventually, because of capitalism, they will be kind of what Jeremy was saying about certain people of the PMC, that because of capitalism, eventually they will be on the chopping block. Like they will see themselves proletarianized, and they'll be more likely to ally with a proletarian cause if they've already been receiving support and information and having relationships, right? So again, something that Tony is always railing on about is like keep making relationships with real people, both in your country and your circumstances and in other places. And Stalin is like, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the best environment for this to happen, right? For the integration of the peasants. He's like, no, you guys are like, they don't matter. Actually, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the best environment for this to happen because they can incrementally, using Soviet power, offer peasants support, build these kind of like hybrid models of production, kind of actually what Joel mentioned, gave us a couple examples before, both in the pre and post-revolutionary periods, and have these like education opportunities on principles of collectivism, like Jeremy was saying. He also talks about the use of co-ops, not just for the sake of having co-ops, right? But intentionally as a tool for revolutionary transition. So again, at the beginning, he's like, trade unions, co-ops, they're bogus. Again, not because they're meaningless, but because they won't lead to socialism. But in the post-revolutionary period, they take on a new life and they offer new opportunities. Before we move on to the next section, anyone have any final thoughts on the peasant question?
I would say that, I guess, circling back to what I was talking about, where Stalin says, we will ally with the peasants because they have revolutionary potential, but we will not sort of onboard their ideas. We're going to re-educate them. I think that's a valuable lesson because I think there are currently, I feel like, two major tendencies of the left, including amongst Marxist-Leninists, and one of these, it's especially amongst Marxist-Leninists, that either there is a tendency to, and we mentioned this in the Rev Left episode, but I'm going to bring it up again, there's a tendency to either, if somebody expresses reactionary views, we just go, okay, well, that's a person I don't want to deal with. I don't want to have anything to do with that person. I don't want them on my side. They could never be a real communist, right? So that's one tendency on the left. And then the other tendency on the left is to go, oh, the working class largely holds reactionary views. I'm going to adopt and encourage them because that's what working people care about. And neither of those things, I think, is terribly useful.
And both of them are kind of insulting to that class of people, right? Both of them really like talk down on and look down on that entire group of people.
Right. Like, we as communists ought to be a lot better. We need to be able to engage with people with whom we disagree, encourage them to become communists, and then guide them out of those worldviews. I mean, and when I say reactionary, I know a lot of people are like, well, reactionary refers to economic concerns. It doesn't have anything to do with social issues. Okay, let's take that at face value. Why are you getting involved in culture war bullshit in the first place? If you are so sure that what we need to do is ally ourselves with people who have these, what I'm going to say are wrong ideas about social concerns, why are you going to adopt those positions? They are irrelevant to class issues, and they are helping to divide the left. You know what I mean? You are not uniting the left. You're not uniting the proletariat either, because there are lots and lots and lots of members of the proletariat who don't believe those things and who are members of these groups that you are marginalizing as a result of this, as Brett called it, tailism. So knock it off. Like, I get it. I get it on the other side.
Knock it off.
But on the other end, please stop just canceling people if they say shit that's like, fucked up. We need to engage with working class people who have these terrible fucking views, and we need to onboard them, and then we need to guide them away from those views. But you can't do that if you don't engage with them.
Without at any point selling yourself out and pretending to believe in things that you don't, right? That always has to be, which by the way, we talk about when we get to section 8, I think. So don't worry, there's more about this, listeners, but it's really, it's a valuable practice for sure.
I'm a radical centrist when it comes to this nonsense.
Wow. I am absolutely going to have someone edit that out of context and just publish it.
It'll be the next DJ DTA, fresh beat.
Okay. We still have 4 more sections to go. Okay.
I believe in us.
I really believe in us. Everyone do your stretchies. Don't let your limbs fall asleep. Everyone listening, do a few jumping jacks. And we're going to move into section 6, the national question. So this one's a big one, yeah? And I think it informs a lot of what's understood and also really a lot of it clarifies a lot of what is misunderstood about the goal of communists even today, right? Like 100 years after. First, Stalin is laying out the limitations of, again, our dear old buddies at the Second International and their position on the national question, because it's basically imbued with a whole lot of like, not exactly categorically like racism, because it's a different historical understanding of race, but certainly some kind of hierarchy between different like kinds of nations, often based on their lack of like clear understanding and analysis of imperialism. Again, because you can have this theory, and if it exists independently of application and analysis, it's just sort of like a headless body floating through the world, or just a bodiless head. We've got to pay really close attention here to both what Stalin is trying to say, and thank you all so much for adding so much to this discussion, the historical moment in which he was saying it. Basically, what I'm saying is he's not falling out of the fucking coconut tree with this one. He is responding to the shortcomings of the Second International. I set it up this way because we as communists are often accused of class reductionism. And some of that critique, I think, comes from a really ungenerous read of this text and texts like it. And in this section, it's easy to be like, oh, see, Stalin doesn't care at all about culture, but that's patently crazy. That is not at all what he's saying. He's criticizing specifically, again, this is about identifying the Marxist-Leninist tendency in comparison to other tendencies of that time. So he's criticizing the Second International because they're offering this quote unquote like cultural autonomy in place of actual political power. So he's not establishing a binary between cultural autonomy and political power. They are, and he is responding to it and rightly criticizing the shortcoming of it. And Stalin's like, look, they don't have to choose. They can absolutely have both cultural autonomy and political power. And because the Second International is only focusing on like so-called kind of culture wars, right? And culture in general, which is a construction that we take for granted today, by the way, Stalin is emphasizing a global united struggle of oppressed people, not to erase their differences, again, but to emphasize their similar goal of not settling for fucking crumbs and other bullshit that the class of people exploiting them are kind of throwing their way. Leninism redefines self-determination in a way that it pushes back against just promises of cultural freedom or even so-called, annexation from colonial powers if it means that they're just going to be exploited in like new and mysterious ways. It challenges the notion of equality of nations, right? Because he's like, if a handful of rich countries is rich because they're exploiting the rest of the countries, how is that equality? Can somebody explain that to me? And again, we take this for granted today, right? This seems really obvious to us listening now, but this is such a radical notion for the time. So Stalin goes on to say that people just assumed that somehow the proletarians of Europe or developed nations could magically overthrow capitalism without the support of those in the colonized world and without revolutionary struggle against imperialism, right? Kind of saying like, if you're just trying to overthrow the Tsar without overthrowing imperialism, you're kind of missing the point. Leninism helps us understand that no, actually, that can't be done. That can't be the case. And we have to overthrow imperialism through global revolutionary struggle to address the violence of capitalism. And the national question can really only be resolved in this way. So then he lays out the actual question, which I'll read here. I didn't in the previous section, even though it is the same question that he poses in the peasant question. But the question is as follows: are the revolutionary potentialities latent in the revolutionary liberation movement of the oppressed countries already exhausted or not? And if not, is there any hope, any basis for utilizing these potentialities for the proletarian revolution, for transforming the dependent and colonial countries from a reserve of the imperialist bourgeoisie into a reserve of the revolutionary proletariat, into an ally of the latter? So again, he's like, it's the same as the peasant question. Is there revolutionary potential here? Check yes or no. And Leninism and Lenin is once again like, hell yes, but with a caveat. Right? So he's like, there are two kinds of nationalism and they are not created equal. And whether or not we support a nationalist movement depends on one thing, and it's which kind of nationalist movement it is. Either the movement is using nationalism to weaken the imperial capitalist power. So here we're looking at the relationship between nationalism and between overall imperial capitalist hegemony. So is it using the nationalism and the national identity to weaken the imperial powers, or is it using nationalism to uphold it? And that's really the only criteria we need. Yeah, sometimes it can be muddied. Like a movement can start out one way in a way that challenges imperialism and then it devolves, or maybe vice versa. And just like with the peasants, we have to be able to analyze it on a case by case basis. And so he gives us this visual where he's like, okay, you're coming. It's like if you're coming from like one side of the room, you're moving from right to left. But if you're coming from the other side of the room, you're moving from left to right. So sometimes you can need one thing and sometimes you can need the opposite thing, right? And that's not at all a contradiction when you actually like understand this.
So Stalin is like... He gives specific examples here. He talks about, and if we can actually discuss how these things may have changed after the fact, but he talks about how the Emir of Afghanistan his movement is anti-imperialist in spite of the fact that he is a pro-monarchist, right? However, there are other movements which are not. He also brings up the Egyptian bourgeois sort of semi-revolution that was going on at the time, which is anti-imperialist and therefore good. But the Labour Party in Britain, who are trying to keep Egypt dependent, are imperialist in nature. So even though this is a Labour Party, even though this is technically, and especially at this time, considered a workers' party, they are in fact serving the interests of imperialism by their fight to keep Egypt dependent upon England. Whereas this bourgeois entity that is taking control of Egypt or trying to take control of Egypt is in fact revolutionary because it is anti-imperialist. So the character of the people who are engaging in this action is not the major factor. It's whether what they are doing is going to help imperialism or hurt imperialism. And that's the thing that you sort of need to latch on to. That's the thing that you need to connect. Like, is this action that's being taken at this moment imperialist or anti-imperialist? If it is anti-imperialist, fight for it, even if it is not socialist in nature. And even if somebody claims to be a socialist, if they are fighting on the side of the imperialists, you must reject that movement, because that's the primary contradiction is imperialism. And that's the thing that we need to keep in our heads when we're analyzing other situations. Now, once any of these revolutionary movements take power, if they then turn around and sell their nation out to imperialists, that's the end of your support for them. You know what I mean? But that's a decision to be decided later on. It's not a thing that you need to, I don't know. It would obviously be better if all anti-imperialist movements were socialist, but that's not the reality of the world.
I mean, it's also, again, this constant stalwart against dogmatism, right? Every single moment, every single turn, every single unfolding needs to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so Stalin is really shifting the narrative. At this point, it's beginning to be a shift of narrative that today it might show a lot more that the narrative originally with Marx and Lenin was more about socialism replacing capitalism and the slow withering away of the state and etc., which we would look into later. But the shift in conversation is where we start to see increasingly a contest between no longer socialism and capitalism, but between imperialism and anti-imperialism. This is an observation from a Marxist scholar here in Argentina, who is Nestor Cohen. I would even add to that in saying that this is like a trailer of what would be happening afterwards. Like, Stalin is already initiating this conversation way before this is actually the most relevant thing, which is today, which is the struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism, and where the discussion between Marxism and liberalism or Marxism and capitalism is not the central discussion in the world anymore.
To kind of summarize and then continue to move forward in the section, he's like, we got two kinds of countries, really. The exploiters and the exploited. And the only way to disrupt or break free of that is Yes, revolutionary struggle. Having what he calls important colonial countries engage in a national liberation movement leads to the crisis of world capitalism. The interests of the proletarians and those in the national liberation movements are the same or similar, and they can unite against the common enemy. Without doing so, there really can't be an overthrow of imperialism. He says this in like 5 different ways, so it's very important. And also he quotes Engels saying, quote, "No nation can be free if it oppresses other nations." So kind of like the example that Jeremy gave before. And he finishes by saying that those participating in revolutionary struggle need to be doing so voluntarily and because there is real respect and mutual confidence amongst peoples. Back to what Tony is always saying. Not to go woke on all y'all, but that means overcoming your own internal biases so that you can see everyone's humanity and actually have relationships with people. Also, he describes this contradiction within capitalism. Joel kind of touched on this before, explaining that on one hand, it creates the conditions for these different nationalist movements, but it also creates dependencies and relationships between countries that in other ways break down national barriers. Of course, we live in a time, like I said before, of really strict immigration, so it can appear that that's not the case, but really it is. Yeah, Joel.
Yes, so in strict definitional terms, when we're talking about imperialism in the context of this text, we're talking about monopoly capitalism or monopoly finance capitalism. And I'm not sure which text it is exactly because I was not able to find it when doing my research. But Lenin, when talking about imperialism, I believe it's in Last Stage of Capitalism, he talks about how the monopoly form can only come from competition. So the original vestiges of capitalism before imperialism was all about capitalist competition. And as these monopolies start forming and they get bigger and bigger and take over larger parts of the world economy, what happens is that there's less and less competition because competition can breed monopoly. But Lenin says monopoly cannot breed competition. So what Lenin describes in imperialism, which is the final stages of imperialism, is where everything becomes monopolized. And with capitalism not having any more free competition, Lenin states that imperialism is the superstructure of capitalism, and capitalism is the base, the substructure. It's the old capitalism, and imperialism is the new characteristics of capitalism built onto the old foundations of the old capitalism. What happens when everything is monopolized is that the imperialist superstructure becomes bankrupt. This is what Lenin describes in the final stage, and what would become to described as the breaking point for world revolution.
Yeah, when it comes to capitalism breeding innovation, as they say, it's kind of like saying alcohol like breeds energy. You know what I mean? Like for a finite period of time, capitalism does breed innovation, and then it kind of goes the opposite direction, right? Your first couple of drinks, maybe you feel more energized, but eventually it kind of drags you under. It's sort of like that. He goes on to say that communism actually is uniquely sort of qualified or capable to integrate all of these opposites and contradictions that we've just been talking about by understanding that nationalism can play a significant role in global communism. Because the colonized world, right? So when we're talking about, for example, modes of production, it's like we've got feudalism, then we kind of move into capitalism, then we maybe move forward into socialism. Similarly, we have this group of people who don't have a national concept, and then we introduce the idea of a national concept, and then through our understanding of our national identity, we're able to play a part of a global system. And so he's saying that colonized peoples in the colonized world, they haven't had the chance to develop their national identity. And so therefore, this step of development can't really be skipped if they want to meaningfully integrate into true internationalism. So again, this might seem like a contradiction or seem like two irreconcilable opposites, but they're not at all if you actually understand the point of these theories. You have to, finally, he really hits this nail on the head one more time, analyze and see things and identify things on a case-by-case basis to analyze them correctly and understand the actions to take as a result of that analysis. All right, that brings us to section 7. Don't worry, everyone. Drink your water, have a snacky. These last 3 sections are a little bit shorter. Again, we're going to do a little compare-contrast with our homies at the Second International and discussing the way that Lenin continued the legacy of Marx and Engels and kind of evolves past it, adding to it. He gives you a little reading list that I'm going to add here, maybe for your back-to-school reads. Lenin's pamphlets, such as What is to be Done, Two Tactics, Imperialism, the State and Revolution, the Proletarian Revolution, and the Renegade Kautsky. Left-wing communism undoubtedly constitute priceless contributions to the general treasury of Marxism, to its revolutionary arsenal. Okay, so if you needed some back-to-school reading, there you go. And he gives us this really awesome definition for what strategy is, right? Because section 7 is about strategy and tactics. So first he identifies what strategy is. I'm going to read it because I think it's really good. Strategy is the determination of the direction of the main blow of the proletariat at a given stage of the revolution. The elaboration of a corresponding plan for the disposition of the revolutionary forces, main and secondary reserves, the fight to carry out this plan through the given stage of the revolution. So the first stage, the objective of the first stage of this revolution, so being applied to the Russian context, the first stage, the objective is to obviously overthrow Tsarism. And again, he says before, you can't do that without challenging imperialism. But the main thrust of that is the proletariat with the peasantry as the reserves. The way this is achieved is by isolating the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie to stop them from trying to win over the peasants. So we're going to see a theme here where it's here are the people who are the main force of doing this. Here are the people who are their backups. And the way that we do it is usually by isolating whoever the most oppressive class force is to stop them from trying to achieve their aims, right? And so basically he's that's kind of the rule here. And we just have to apply it. We have to be able to correctly identify all of the different features of this at the given stage of the revolution. So the second stage is then to overthrow imperialism in Russia and withdrawal from imperial war. The main force, again, is the proletariat, and the reserves are specifically the poor peasants. Okay, so again, understanding that the peasants as a class have their own actually subclasses, and it's important at every stage of the revolution to continue to reanalyze the different facets and factors so that you can understand with whom you can build relationships, with whom you can have real allies, and with whom you're probably not going to be able to get a lot of support from and may even be antagonistic to you. The main force, again, is the proletariat. We've got the poor peasants, and they're working to isolate the petty bourgeois to stop them from trying to offer basically shitty compromises to marginalized people. And again, this is achieved by forming alliances with those that they identify as basically semi-proletarian. In the third stage, the main thrust is to consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country. And in this case, it's the USSR. And to use that as the home base for defeating imperialism globally. Here, the main force is quite broad now because it's the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country, the USSR, and the revolutionary movements everywhere else. The secondary force is the semi-proletarians and the small peasants in the developed countries, and the liberation movements elsewhere. Here, they're aiming to isolate the petty bourgeois Dems and the Second International again. It's interesting to see that as we move through the revolution, there are some parties or some organizations or some groups of people that we kind of have some things in common with. And so our conflicts with them are just not primary and need to be dealt with at a later time. And so we're not really dealing with or addressing the Second International until we get pretty late, right? We're in the third stage of the revolution. Basically, in some ways, the same as step 2, but instead of just one country, now we're examining what that would look like when it's global. Then he explains what a tactic is. So he's explaining the strategy, which is kind of the main thrust. But then we have to determine the tactic. And a tactic is something relatively small that is in service to the strategy. By the way, for all you acting heads out there, Stanislavski tries to kind of apply Marxism to acting, which is why you have the character's main focus of the scene, their core intention of the scene, and then you have your different tactics, which are the beats that you play. So we actually see this reflected a lot of places. Pretty interesting. On tactics, there's a quote here I'll just read. Tactics are the determination of the line of conduct of the proletariat in the comparatively short period of the flow or ebb of the movement, of the rise or decline of the revolution. While the object of strategy is to win the war against Tsarism, let us say, or against the bourgeoisie, to carry through the struggle against Tsarism or against the bourgeoisie to its end, tactics pursue less important objects, for their aim is not the winning of the war as a whole, but the winning of some particular engagements or some particular battles, the carrying through successfully of some particular campaigns or actions corresponding to the concrete circumstances in a given period or rise or decline of the revolution. Tactics are a part of strategy, subordinate to it and serving it. So it's describing tactics are in service of the strategy. They're not intended to override the strategy. One of the main points he discusses on strategic leadership, so we're going to talk about a little bit like tactical leadership and strategic leadership. One of the main points he discusses on strategic leadership is tracking the intensity of the class conflict and the crisis. Again, remember, we used to think it was about richness. We used to think it was about development. He's like, no, man, we got to look for these hot spots. We got to look for the intensity of the crisis or the class conflict to determine when someone or a group of people is ripe for allyship. Because again, he's saying, look, we can't engineer the circumstances for revolution. That is something that capitalism will serve us on its own. Our job is to stay ready so we don't have to get ready. We now know that as conditions change for people, their understanding of their options are going to change accordingly, right? When we were talking about the peasant question earlier. He reiterates Marx and Engels via Lenin on insurrection, which I think is worth our time. So one, never play with insurrection. But when beginning it, firmly realize that you must go to the end. 2, concentrate a great superiority of forces at the decisive point, at the decisive moment. Otherwise, the enemy, who has the advantage of better preparation and organization, will destroy the insurgents. 3, once the insurrection has begun, you must act with the greatest determination and by all means, without fail, take the offensive. The defensive is the death of every armed uprising. 4, you must try to take the enemy by surprise and seize the moment when his forces are scattered. You gotta catch him with his pants down. 5, you must strive for daily success. This is like, he's really addressing the mental and emotional needs of the revolutionaries. Even if a small, one might say hourly, if it is the case of one town, and at all costs retain the moral ascendancy. He then tells us how to identify the time to strike the final blow, as he says, and that is at the moment basically of maximum crisis. And the inertia for this is all the class forces antagonistic to the proletariat are at each other's throats. This is what we were talking about before about intra-capitalist conflict. They're all at each other's throats. They're distracted under the weight of their own contradictions. And when the petty bourgeois have already exposed themselves with their inconsistencies, the people don't have trust in them anymore. And when the proletariat has begun to grow and take revolutionary action against the ruling classes, then, if we've correctly analyzed that moment, revolution is ripe and victory is assured. He says, though, if you don't correctly analyze this, it results in something called a loss of tempo, which is, Jeremy spoke about this before, where the party is either tailing behind the masses or ahead of the masses. This is bad because you have to pursue the course that's adopted. And if you're losing your connection to the main base, you're not able to sort of like keep pace with what the moment calls for. You can't really like keep your finger on the pulse. Otherwise, it's sort of what he calls like losing your bearings, which obfuscates the relationship between tactics and strategy. And also, he says you have to know when to retreat. That retreating is also a tactic that can be in service to the larger strategy. Knowing when to attack, basically, is nothing without also knowing when to retreat.
I've got a reflection here from Chairman Mao. He says, it is not enough to set tasks. We must also solve the problem of the methods for carrying them out. If our task is to cross a river, we cannot cross it without a bridge or a boat. Unless the bridge or boat problem is solved, it is idle to speak of crossing the river. Unless the problem of method is solved, to talk about the task is useless.
Banger.
I also have one more quote from Marta Harnecker, who I'm not sure if she's still living. She's a Chilean comrade who, in exile in Havana, Cuba, when exiled from the Pinochet regime, she explains that Lenin's use of social forces in strategy and tactic is also applied by Stalin. So Lenin proposes analyzing the correlation of social forces as opposed to the social classes. He speaks in terms of forces at a conjuncture. So with the current context and material conditions, in order to effect a change in that correlation of forces, in order to practice a social transformation. So this would be in opposition to the proposal by opportunism, which is to see these social forces and find a way to fit into them in a way that would bring about opportunities. So to adapt the movement to the social forces. In the case of Leninism, what would be the proposal would be to actually affect and change the social forces. That's what Marta Harnecker is proposing.
So, Ray, I wanted to add on to the point you were making about it being important to know when to retreat, as it is to know when the right time is to attack. In terms of retreat, of course, I'm not only meaning in like a military attack sense, but also in whatever say, for example, the economic plan to construct socialism may require those retreats as well. And so I'm actually going to quote here from an article by Gabriel Rockhill. In this kind of excerpt I'm going to read, he actually uses one of Lenin's metaphors for what these retreats can look like and how they can be misinterpreted by those who may not want the revolution to actually go forward. So I'll start the quote here. Rockhill states that Lenin once described a scene in which a mountain climber seeking to access a summit that had never been attained was forced to turn back, descend, seek another path, longer, perhaps, but one that would enable him to reach the summit. At a safe distance, people watched his movements through a telescope and maliciously derided him for failing to attain his goal. Some gleefully celebrated his lack of success and denounced him as a lunatic, hoping he would fall, whereas others concealed their glee and feigned sorrow over the fact that the poor soul had not awaited the completion of their well-thought-out plan for scaling the mountain. They all agreed, however, that what they saw before their eyes was a clear case of failure. The onlookers in this metaphor rely on sense perception to arrive at the conclusion. What they saw was a mountain climber turning back from the summit and descending. What they lacked was understanding. Since the climber could not advance on the chosen path, the only possible way of making it to the summit was to descend and to find another one. And so Rockhill goes on to explain that this metaphor was actually in a direct reference by Lenin to the new economic program, which required the temporary introduction of some free market and capitalism into their new socialist project. In making this connection, this metaphor to the NEP, the new economic program, we see that what sometimes can appear to be in front of us to be a retreat, to be a step backward, at the level of sense perception, as in from what we can just see, it looks like it's a total retreat. But in reality, it's simply a necessary maneuver in order to successfully advance strategically or tactically to the goal of building socialism eventually.
Right. Like everything can be a tactic. And in this purpose, retreat is one tactic that leads us toward the overall strategy of revolution or of socialism or of whatever phase of revolution that you're in.
A few examples of this would be the offensive, the defensive, and the resistance. These are all completely different stages of tactics that are implemented by different groups, different organizations at different places and periods of time.
Yeah, that's really good. And it kind of segues to, in addition to these sort of hot tips for strategic leadership, we also get some information on tactical leadership. And basically, it's kind of like what you just said, Tony. That was like the perfect crystallization of the relationship between tactics and strategy. And he's sort of like timing and understanding the like order of operations is vitally important every step of the journey. So basically, if you learned like PEMDAS in school, it's basically a revolutionary PEMDAS. And so just like there's two kinds of nationalism, we also have two types of tactics, revolutionary tactics and reformist tactics. And we have to learn how we can spot the difference between when a tactic is revolutionary versus when it's reformist. So he's like, y'all think we don't compromise, but that's actually not true. We know that compromises and small improvements and reforms are not small for working people. He's like, so it's not the reforms themselves, whatever, fight for reforms. That's great. It's just that like when the national identity isn't in service to the broader movement, when the reforms are not in service to the broader movement, right? The goal is revolution. The goal is not reform, because legal work can be done alongside, and I'll quote, illegal work, right? Or extra legal work. And therefore it can be used toward revolutionary ends. By contrast, The reformist is like, no, just do these little reforms instead of anything illegal or extra legal or anything that fundamentally challenges or changes our system, right? He does say, though, this is interesting, after revolution, when you're governed by the dictatorship of the proletariat, you can, kind of like what Tony was saying before, strategically and occasionally choose to take a slower reformist path to prepare the conditions for future revolutionary action. So yeah, it is a reformist path technically, but again, it functions to strengthen the ruling class, which in this case, right? So he's saying basically, if you're doing a reform, the reform is always strengthening the class that's in power. But if it's after revolution, then the class that's in power is the dictatorship of the proletariat. So doing these reforms can also serve to strengthen the class in power, which in this case is the class that we want to be in power. And he underlines this because he's basically like, look, Marx kind of didn't really know how to make this point because in his time, he couldn't see that. But it's also only because of Marxism that we're able to understand this. And that basically the function of reform, again, is always to strengthen whatever class is in power. So when it's the class that we want in power, it can be a tool, which takes us to Section 8, the party. But before we get to that, does anyone have any thoughts about Section 7?
I think the conclusion would be, the question would be reform or revolution, and the answer here would be reform and revolution.
Right, and understanding the relationship between both of those two and when to employ which tactic in favor of the strategy. You're absolutely right that reform can be a tactic for revolution, and also sometimes it's not, and it's on us to determine which is which. Taking us to Section 8, which is on the party. So first, we get into kind of why the Second International wasn't a revolutionary party. And it's basically because it was a party that was adapted to electoralism. And it was a party built to run candidates in existing bourgeois elections. So they'd never be up to the challenge of leading a revolution because that's not the function of their party. But now, in this moment, in his moment, he's talking about the needs and the opportunity for true international solidarity and saying that these aims are in fundamental conflict with the aims of the existing parties. So you can never rely on this party to guide the revolution, and doing so will always break your heart. Who does that sound like? So you need a new revolutionary party. And what might that party entail? Well, he tells us. First, he's like, it has to be the advanced detachment of the working class. Okay, so I think that this phrase will become clear as we keep talking about it, but basically this is like this is like the Christian expression like in this world but not of it. Like it's basically like you're still connected to the masses, but you're also tasked with seeing the bigger picture and kind of holding people to that standard and inviting people to rise and knowing what to do when, kind of Jeremy, what you were touching on earlier in a sense. So yes, the party is of course part of the working class, and in terms of their relationship to like the means of production, they are workers and proletarians, and the transition from capitalism to communism, right? But in terms of the relationship to the knowledge, the strategy, the tactics, the leadership that we just covered in the previous section, there's a difference between those in the party and those they're trying to support and educate. He also said it has to be the best elements of the working class, their revolutionary spirit, and they must be armed with revolutionary theory. Again, completely refuting the idea that Lenin and Leninists are not concerned with theory. Without this, they're not going to be able to lead the revolution. It can't just succumb to like the emotional whims or the daily observations or the worshiping of spontaneity, but it also can't tail behind the masses, right? So this is a really delicate balance that has to be assessed in almost a moment by moment basis. It has to raise class consciousness effectively. It has to lead. It has to be able to see ahead effectively, but it also can't lose touch with the masses. Otherwise, it's just going to devolve into this kind of disenfranchised, disconnected unionism.
And also, there was an alternative theory to dictatorship of the proletariat, which was not, I wouldn't say popular at this time, but was suggested at this time. Old Bolshevik Zinoviev supported this particular line. He supported dictatorship of the party, and Stalin vehemently argued against it. But there is a balance. And obviously in this text, he's saying, we can't just sort of follow the masses blindly. We can't just, latch on to whatever ideas they have. We need to be in a leadership position. But when he's speaking to or addressing Zinoviev's support for dictatorship of the party, he says this is going to undermine the trust that we built between the working classes and ourselves if we grant ourselves abstract and unlimited powers, this is not going to serve to build socialism. This is going to cause a rift between us and the workers. We must meet with the masses and draw on them for strength. We cannot lead them with sort of impunity. So there is like this balancing act that has to be, as you mentioned, like taking place between these two concepts, essentially.
Yeah, he says that doing this well is literally as complicated as war. Joel, do you have something?
Yes, in terms of how the USSR was formed at this point, what I think Stalin is trying to explain is that in this one-party system, the party represents the whole people and not one particular sector. And at the same time, with the party being the representation of the mass of people, the party has an armed wing, which in this case would be the Red Army. So if we look into the actual details of how the Soviet state worked, the Soviet state did not have its own army. There was no national army. The Red Army was the armed wing of the party. And it stopped being the armed wing of the party close to the time when the USSR was dissolved. And it's the case today that China still maintains this system. And it's a whole different kind of proposal of what representativity is, or what it means, what democracy means to us, more than just the day that we go to put our ballot in a box. It's sort of proposing that democracy is a bit more complex than just the Western parameters for what democracy is.
Yeah, that's super true. And like kind of to your point, Stalin is saying like, look, in the immediate post-revolutionary period, there are still levels. There has to be then a hierarchy in the party because classes still exist. So he's not saying that this sort of like quote unquote vanguardism that I think gets critiqued a lot. He's not saying that this is an inherent thing that always has to exist. He's saying that in direct response to the material conditions of the post-revolutionary period where there are still classes, there needs to be sort of, in a sense, corresponding hierarchy within the party. And because capitalism and its attacks are so varied, in order to adequately handle that, the party has to be incredibly disciplined and incredibly organized. So there needs to be this nuanced balance, like you guys have been saying, between leading the party and also leading the non-party members and staying connected to their thoughts and feelings, but also not totally placating them because the level of consciousness needs to be raised. And honestly, I think so many of the critiques of the ML line arise out of a result of not actually engaging with this not understanding this well enough, to be honest, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I would say that the average non-Marxist Leninist would assume that Stalin was in favor of dictatorship of the party because their assumption is that he just wanted to direct from his, whatever seat on high, anything and everything that was going on. But
he wanted to direct from his seat on high while also like never being anywhere, right? It's like he gets characterized as this like insane authoritarian and also this kind of like deadbeat dad.
Stalin never had executive power. He was never the supreme commander of the armed forces of any nation.
No, and he refused to accept command of the Red Army when it was offered to him. And again, like, we're going to get into this in the Stalin series, but there are many, many, many cases where he had the opportunity to become a dictator and he rejected the opportunity. There were many opportunities for him to have power that he could have exercised in a way that was dictatorial, and he refused it and argued against it time after time after time. He is not the guy you think he is.
And so to this point, Jeremy, that's actually a great segue because a little bit later in this section, he's talking about the party. Essentially, this is mentioned before, but it's fleshed out a little bit more here. The party as a constellation of smaller parties and departments. Obviously, this can serve the purpose of meeting a diverse population's needs. And I feel like through Stalin's career, we see that that's really important to him. Like in the past, we see that, and we also see this today with those who are like, co-op is the only way. Like, yes, you can have smaller groups, and of course that's essential, but also they have to be organized and united as a whole to form an effective revolutionary party. He's like, haters will say it's bureaucracy, right? As a critique that we still see all the time today. And he's like, okay, but without that level of order and organization, it's literally impossible to meet the needs of the people. So people who are critiquing bureaucracy as a deterrent to meeting the needs of the people don't really understand the function and the necessity of this level of organization. And Lenin says that these critiques just need to be like swept aside, like just stop engaging with them. Before we move on to a final few notes in this section, does anyone have any thoughts on explaining kind of what party membership means in this case? Because it's quite different for a lot of folks, especially like Americans. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
To be honest, I don't think I would do a great job of explaining what was requirement of being part of the party. But what I can say, though, is that I think one of the reasons Stalin devotes an entire section to talking about the party and the specific work is that the Communist Party in the Soviet Union is actually undergoing a huge increase in its membership. So upon Lenin's death in January 1924, not only does the party see it as a necessity to increase kind of like the industrial workers as members of the party, but the general population of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death is now kind of like energized, or they've experienced a reinvigoration of, that here's a socialist project that we can all be a part of, and the party is a vehicle through which we can do that. So this led to an increase in party membership from about, I think it's like 400,000 roughly at the start of 1924 to 1 million about a year and a half later. So the party's going through huge increase. It's diversifying its population, because I believe at the start of 1924, most of the party members were like white collar working people, right?
So essentially, something, without going into it too much as we're cresting into 3 hours on this episode, is being a party member it's a participatory experience in a very specific way that is not really the same as, say, if you're like an American and in high school civics class, you like sign your name up to this one box and then don't really have to think about it. And the reason that I think that that's important is it's important to understand that there are other people who are ideologically aligned with socialism and communism, but for whatever reason, they're not interested in being full party members, right? So I just want to put that there, that your understanding of being in the party and what it means to be a party member is a little bit different than the way that we would understand it. Many of us would understand it today. That said, he also talks about non-party things that do have their place, right? So here's where he's getting into co-ops, trade unions, women's associations, cultural organizations, youth organizations, and the like. He says they're necessary because without them, you can't really understand and meet the needs of a diverse population, and you can't replace the bourgeois order. But how do they work alongside the party? They really all have to be serving one class, and that class is the dictatorship of the proletariat. But then he asks, who gets to determine that? Who's experienced and trustworthy enough to decide? And he's like, yeah, that's the party of the proletariat. So the party gets to decide if somebody is way too far outside of being aligned with and serving the dictatorship of the proletariat. He also talks about the party as an expansive force that fortifies, strengthens the proletariat, educates the remaining or sort of like former bourgeois, and fights against backsliding toward the old ways. This is where he also says that once the classes quote unquote wither away, the party too will also wither away. So basically, like, the party is in the business of putting itself out of business. When it comes to factionalism, he's like, look, you just got to maintain the party line. That might be a hot take, but people have to know what to expect. They have to know who to look to. You just have to be trustworthy, and you can't be trustworthy if you're just hithering and dithering, right? If you can't do that, you just got to leave, which is when he talks about purging opportunists. So again, there are different points in the revolution where the party serves different function. And once we've achieved that sort of consolidation of Soviet power, we cannot see these opportunists as allies in any meaningful way, because they're not really there to serve the aims of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He says the proletariat also isn't static. It's always in motion because of shifting material conditions. Just like the sort of bourgeoisified become the proletarianized, they penetrate, his words not mine, into the party. And with them come their like sad, bad vibes. So this can disrupt the party from within. And it's important that he says we need to fight back against that. And he also talks about allies in the rear, but hey, that's for another theory beat for another day. And he's like, look, you can pretend you can overcome this. You can let them stay. But honestly, it's a shitty idea and it will bring down the vibes for the whole party. So those who don't or can't take the party line, they just have to leave. And again, it's important to understand the level of participation required to be a full party member, right? So if you're not a party member, it doesn't mean that you're like literally an exile, although that can happen on a case by case basis. It just means that like you're not welcome because you're not representative of the party that's in power, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? So cohesion, he's saying, within the party at this point is the utmost important. It is of the first priority. And I'll say it, it's a hot take, but we gotta say he's got the evidence to back it up. Okay, coming into section 9, style in work. This section is, like I said, really short, and it's about what makes a Leninist worker or like a worker who's useful to the movement. Basically, he's like, what is a Leninist worker? Because they're special. And he says it's this mix of Russian revolutionary sweep and American efficiency, which I'm kind of like, weird, but okay, I love that for you. Basically, it's like on one hand, these workers, they have to be able to like overcome inertia. They have to overcome conservatism, and they can't be submitting themselves to these like ancient traditions. And this is balanced with the sort of like can-do attitude, a pride in one's work, a self-motivation, and like a follow-through. That if you can only have one or the other, there are going to be issues. But when you can marry the two together, you can cultivate the environment needed to sustain revolutionary work. And that's really it. Does anyone have any thoughts on section 9?
I think Stalin marks a clear difference with how for example, when talking about the American style, the US is, as he says, it's like an efficiency. People go to, I don't know how he assumes people go to work on time or something, but I think they do have a certain efficiency at the economic level that is profit driven, and Stalin is breaking with that profit driven efficiency, and he's saying that there can be efficiency and it doesn't necessarily have to be profit driven, which we see this is taken back by Khrushchev when he undoes that and makes the USSR profit driven.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we have finally made it through all of the sections, and that's really, what we're doing today.
When I read American efficiency in that last part, I was like, oh no, Stalin mega communist confirmed. It's like, oh fuck, they're right.
Oh Lord.
Just kidding.
That about does it for this episode. Thanks so much to Ray and to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Elijah, Jack, Hewlett, Meinhof was right, Errol, Corey, Dylan, Ryan, Hannah, Matt, Gregory, and once
Food
again,
stamp.
if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/prolspod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolspod@outlook.com.
Death to imperialism.
Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.